so you don't have.
You did? You could have said, like, you know, they started at $50 and went up.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Mic's working right? All right. Well, thank you to Emerald City Comic Con for having us today. This panel is to discuss the 50th anniversary and commemorate that anniversary of Fantagraphics, publisher of the world's greatest cartoonists. Today we have, I'm just gonna do a quick intro of everyone down the line. Next to me is Gary Groth, co-founder, publisher and president, and longtime editor of the Comics Journal. Next to him is Eric Reynolds, associate publisher and vice president. Next to Eric is Megan Kelso. She first published with the Fantagraphics about 25 years ago in the Comics Journal Winter Special of 2001. Her most recent book with Fantagraphics was Who Will Make the Pancakes? Jim Woodring has been with Fantagraphics for almost 40 years. He's best known for his character Frank, the star of many books and comics, and has an upcoming book, Quacky, also starring Frank. After that is Max Clotfelter, longtime employee, current warehouse manager, and a fine cartoonist himself. And at the end there is Mike Catron, co-founder of the Comics Journal and a current editor at Fantagraphics Books, where he edits some of the best comics of all time, like our EC Artist series and the complete Carl Barks. Gary, let's start with you. You and Mike Catron started the journal in 1976. Can you talk about what your aims for the magazine were when you started, outside of survival?
That was, of course, a big one. Yeah, when we started the journal, you know, what we wanted to do was to create a magazine that treated comics seriously as an art form, and that journalistically treated the comic book industry, which was so relatively minuscule compared to what it is today, with some serious journalistic chops. I mean, we wanted to do news articles about the Comics Journal. We wanted to give voice to cartoonists who worked in the industry, who didn't really previously have a voice. You know, we sort of introduced an era of muckraking in the comic book industry. This is when the comics were dominated by Marvel and DC. Probably, I don't know, 80 or 90% of comics being published were published by Marvel and DC, and then you know, there were very few small comics publishers. There were underground comics publishers, but they weren't doing very much at the time. And so, you know, one of our aims was basically to, I don't know, I think we were deluded enough to have a reformist agenda. We thought we could actually reform corporate comics. And if we couldn't do that, we could at least bludgeon them in every issue of the Comics Journal, which we did succeed in doing. And then, you know, that was in '76, and then, you know, around that time, a lot of new comics publishers started coming up, a lot of independent comics publishers. Some of those publishers were basically imitating Marvel and DC comics, like Pacific Comics and Eclipse and First Comics. And then there were a handful of publishers who were doing the kinds of comics that we envisioned at the time, but that were rarely being done. One interesting thing is that in '76, the kinds of comics that we envisioned, and you know, you can call them art comics or literary comics or alternative comics, there were very few examples of those being done at that time. It was few and far between. And so we actually sort of collectively willed those comics into being. Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly's Raw started publishing, I think, in 1981, or was it 1980? And Weirdo, Robert Crumb's Weirdo started coming out at that time. Independent publishers did start coming up, self-publishers started coming up, and you know, the late 70s and 80s turned into a really revolutionary period in the history of comics. And we were just fortunate enough to start the Comics Journal at the absolute nadir of comics history. And then we were able to see, you know, some creative flourishing in the decade or so after that.
The next question is for Mike down there. Mike, the journal was combative from the beginning, as Gary alluded to. Can you talk in some ways about that willingness to say uncomfortable things and how that may have helped change things for the better in the industry, you know, for workers, for creators?
Well, at the time that, is this working? At the time,
Turn it on.
how do you do that? Now? Okay, try it again. At the time we started the Comics Journal, the industry, as Gary said, was dominated by Marvel and DC, and the deal that the artists got amounted to more or less indentured servitude. And we felt quite strongly that the artists should be able to make a decent living off of their work, but they were entitled to things like royalties and better treatment and things like that. And so we were, in that sense, we were an advocate for the creative side of comics, because we wanted you know, better artists and writers to do comics. So yeah, we were combative in that sense, and we would try to hold up what we could find as a better example, and at the same time annoy or irritate Marvel and DC, and encourage the artists themselves to strike out. So we were, you know, kind of trying to pry the best people out into a better situation. And eventually people started coming to us after they saw we were around for a little while, and kind of, you know, complaining, telling us what kind of deal they were getting and how they were being treated and so on and so forth. And that encouraged other people to come out with their stories and so on. And over time, this kind of movement or conversation swelled up, and people started asking for better deals and royalties and things like that, especially once these independent publishers started giving those things and luring people away from Marvel and DC.
Yeah, it's interesting that Mike used the word movement, because that was part of my next question for Eric. You joined the company about 35 years ago, give or take. The company was pretty well formed by then. The journal, already publishing comics, alternative and classic comics. Did you have the sense that you were part of a movement at that time?
Yeah, in two ways. I showed up at Fantagraphics' doorstep when I was just like a week after my 22nd birthday. And I came for the Comics Journal because I believed in the journal's agenda, and I wanted to be a part of it. But at the same time, I was also reading the comics, and you know, I was very young, and you know, so you had the movement of the Comics Journal within the comic book industry, which was more of like a professional kind of movement. And then you had what Fantagraphics was publishing with Hate and 8-Ball, and Jim and Peter Bagg and whatnot. And that was more like a cultural youth movement that I personally felt like very much a part of. And I think that's an interesting aspect of Fantagraphics, that it has this, you know, this It has its journal history. It has its history as like a part of 90s counterculture, youth counterculture. And then, you know, it's morphed into this thing that's more akin to something like, you know, the Criterion of channel of comics or whatever. So yeah.
Jim number 1 was published 40 years ago, give or take. They'd only been publishing alternative comics for a few years at that point. You know, when you came aboard, did it feel prestigious to be published by Fantagraphics, or was it still too new? And were you aware of the other cartoonists?
Oh, I was well aware that Fantagraphics is, is this on?
No.
No, hold on. There we go. I was well aware that Fantagraphics was publishing great cartoonists, and I was honored when Gary told me he would publish my work if I would just put some comics in it. Because I was self-publishing this magazine called Jim, which was like the trash can for all my thoughts. And
Great trash can.
Yeah, wonderful trash can. And Gary said, well, I like this, and I would publish it if there were comics in it. And I said, well, I can do that. I'm pretty good with my hands. So I started, thanks to Gary, I became a cartoonist, an opportunist.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's true. You knew it, you just forgot.
Right. Yeah.
Megan, it's been about 25 years for you. You were already being published by Highwater Books when they gave up the Ghost, and then you've been with Fantagraphics ever since. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts and feelings when you came to Fantagraphics, when you made that move? And you're from here. Did that play any role in wanting to be with part of the company, or did it have any role at all?
When I first did some work for Fantagraphics, I'd already been drawing comics for about 10 years. Is mine on?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. And I started when I was going to the Evergreen State College in Olympia, and I'd always liked to draw and write stories, and I had this boyfriend who said, you should draw comics, you've got, you know, the skills for it. And a lot of the comics he showed me were things that Fantagraphics was publishing, like Love and Rockets and Neat Stuff and 8-Ball. And I remember him telling me, yeah, and they have a magazine called the Comics Journal where they write these like really like erudite reviews of comics, and I was like, you've gotta be kidding. like I couldn't really wrap my head around that. But you know, after college I moved back to Seattle and quickly, you know, learned that Fantagraphics had just moved to Seattle a few years before, and a lot of cartoonists were converging on Seattle because of that, and that was a very exciting time to be kind of starting out. And then, so my first actual, like I had met people who worked at Fantagraphics, but my first kind of professional encounter with the company was that Gary reached out to interview me about my book, Queen of the Black, which Highwater had published, which was very flattering and fun. And so I appeared, in the Comics Journal. That was my first professional encounter. And then I later...
So sorry.
Then he later invited me to contribute to an anthology called the Comics Journal Summer or Winter Special, and then that led to publishing books with them. So it was a fairly slow progression.
But an exciting one.
Very exciting.
Max, you've been with the company for almost a decade at this point in a couple of different roles. First of all, is it everything you ever dreamed it would be? And second of all, I guess what drew you to the company in the first place, other than just paying the rent?
I mean, it's a lot more fun than I thought it would be, and a lot more serious than I thought it would be. You know, and it's about like managing the balance there of like, it is kind of like comic book company and it's Fantagraphics and everything. There's this sort of like, there was this sort of like, people talk about it, but you know, like it's like some, you know, kind of the atmosphere of the culture was a certain way, you know, but you also go in there and you got a job to do, you know, so it's like finding that balance and just finding your groove and just figuring out what you can do to help, you know, keep the process going forward and, you know, efficient and, you know, doing a decent job. And it's, you know, it's a lot of fun. I was at like a paralegal, and I lost my job. The firm I worked for dissolved, and I just, you know, Jack Cohen, a friend, just posted onto Facebook that they needed some help in the warehouse, and I was like, hey, I need a job, you know, just started out there, and that was about 10 years ago. So, a little modest, like 3-day week thing, and then next thing you know, you just show up and do a good job, and you know, they'll take care of you. It's kind of it.
You know, we should mention that forthcoming is going to be a collection of Max's work from FU Press.
See?
Fantastic.
Dreams do come true. Like, look at that.
Here's the giant check. $4.80.
It bounced.
Yes.
No, I'm joking.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that now, because I was wondering if that was going to happen. Gary, back to you. You were one of the first publishers to try to get comics into bookstores.
Oh my God. Yeah.
With the thought that if the reading public found Love and Rockets, a wider and more literate audience would buy and read comics.
That was our dream.
Yes, that didn't work out for a while. But eventually, can you talk about that journey, trying to break out of the comic shop ghetto and getting into bookstores?
Yeah, you know, we had and have a love-hate relationship with the comic book market, because you know, it was dominated by Marvel and DC. They sort of owned the comic shops. In '76, I don't know how many shops there were at least a couple thousand. And by '76, or at least by, let's say, 1980, there were multiple distributors. And of course, you know, we appreciated that because we had a distribution channel. We had a kind of ready-made distribution channel. For several years, there were only 2 distributors, Phil Sewelling at Seagate and Bud Plant. And whatever we produced, the Comics Journal or you know, any of the earliest comics, they would take them and distribute them to the comic shops. But you know, the comic shops purview was so provincial and so narrow. It was sort of exactly what we were trying to break out of, you know, aesthetically. And so in the 80s, we sort of saw bookstores as the holy grail. Like if we could only get into bookstores, you know, they would, you know, truly appreciate the genius of the Hernandez brothers or Dan Clowes or Jim Woodring. That wasn't quite how it turned out. You know, I had this idea that if we could only find this broader, more literate audience, that, you know, we could just produce, you know, nothing but bestsellers because the work was so good, and we would find this audience. We started with a distributor in 1987 or 8, by the name of Berkeley Books, which was one of the biggest publishers and distributors in the country. And they were suddenly interested in distributing what were then called graphic novels, which was a new marketing term at the time, because of the success of Mouse and Watchmen. And both these books sold tens of thousands and then eventually hundreds of thousands of copies. And so other publishers started, you know, mainstream publishers like Simon & Schuster and Random House and so on, started getting interested in comics, and they thought that they could just start publishing graphic novels and they would sell as well as Watchmen and Mouse. Berkeley Books courted us and 3 or 4 other publishers, which would include Kitchen Sink, First Comics, and ElfQuest, War Graphics. And they wanted to distribute our books, and they thought they could get some sort of critical mass. They could get these books into bookstores, and so we were with them for about 2 years. And of course, we knew nothing about the book trade, and we knew nothing about distributing books in the book trade. And I learned eventually that their philosophy was that if you throw enough shit against the wall, some of it could stick, and the shit was our books. Their sales reps had no idea what we were doing. They didn't know anything about comics. Graphic novels was an unknown category. Retail stores didn't know what they were. So we placed a lot of books in bookstores that bookstores didn't know what to do with at that time. They would rack a lot of our books in the humor section because, after all, they were comics. And so that kind of proved to be a disaster. We were with them for about 2 or 3 years, and I'm pretty sure that all the publishers just met with so much resistance in the book trade that it didn't do any good. And then after that, we blew through a number of distributors in the 90s. I remember a period where distributors would just keep going out of business. And when a distributor goes out of business, they don't own anything. They don't own a warehouse, they don't own the books, they don't own anything, so they just go out of business owing you money, and then they evaporate. And then you have to find another distributor. And then finally in 2000, I think it was 2001, we hooked up with W.W. Norton, who is the largest independent book publisher in New York. And I had to spend several meetings persuading them that graphic novels was actually a viable category that they could do something with. They were reasonably skeptical of this. They just didn't have any idea that this could fly. And we had a really great relationship with them over the last 25 years, and they've done a good job, and they stuck with it. And they were there when retailers did not know what a graphic novel was. And now about, I don't know, I think maybe 60% of our books are actually distributed in the book trade. But the book trade did not turn out to be this paradise of literate readers that we were looking for. And in a lot of ways, things have actually regressed for adult graphic novels since, the 2000s.
Still looking for paradise.
Yeah. That would be the title of my autobiography.
Mike, people, I think, tend to think of Fantagraphics as an alternative or literary comics publisher. But as an editor, you work on some of the best material that the company's ever published, even if it is technically republishing. How does the EC Artist series and the complete card books fit into the company's history of publishing classic material?
Well, when we say we're the publisher of the world's greatest cartoonists, it's literally true. Not only the cartoonists of today, but comics have a vast history, both within this country and internationally. And that goes back to, the early days of newspaper comic strips. So a couple of things that I work on, the EC books, for example, we are reprinting in a very special way all of the work that was published by EC Comics from about 1950 to about 1955, before they were basically run out of business. They went on to continue with MAD, but their comic book business ended, more or less coinciding with the advent of the Comics Code. But that was one of the best comic book companies ever to exist in this country. And we are reprinting everything they did. At the same time, during that same period, Dell Comics was publishing a whole lot of stuff, but one of the things they were publishing was Walt Disney's Comics and Stories and Uncle Scrooge, which were drawn by Carl Barks, who is truly one of the greatest cartoonists of all time. And we are reprinting all of his work for Dell in a series that's now up around 30 volumes. I expect it to go to around 38 volumes before we're finished. So we're closing in on the last days of getting all that stuff back into print. We also do another series I work on is The Crazy Cat. We're reprinting George Harriman's Sunday pages, which are just amazing and stunning. One of the things that I want to mention is that when we got into doing things back in the day in our first comics, we were kind of constrained by the idea of what a comic book was, which was a certain size, maybe 8.5 by 11. That was like a big breakthrough. But now we do comics in books that are the size that the art calls for. We have announced a book of Karl Barks, or we will soon announce a book of Karl Barks, that's 1.5 feet wide by more than 2 feet tall, because we're reproducing the original art. And that's the size it was drawn, and that's the size we think people want to see it. So, and we've done things in between. The Prince Valiants that we do are oversized. So a lot of times we're taking a project and deciding on the format based on the content rather than the other way around. And as I said, we continue to do that in both current modern cartoonists and the legends of the past.
Eric, how important is it to you to continue to find new cartoonists and to stay abreast of what's going on out there in comics? You mentioned that it's almost like a criterion label for comics, but you do still publish work by new people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that has to be part of the mission. It was from day one, when Gary started publishing comics. And even with the journal, demanding new comics that were of a standard of quality. So I feel like that's always been as much a part of Fantagraphics' mission as any get-go. I think it's, you can only, there'd be a danger in just having only an eye towards the past. So I think staying current and contemporary, is just essential to the not just the sort of vibrancy of Fanta, but just the medium in general, and our own engagement and interest in the medium. And I love Karl Barks and EC Comics as much as anybody, but I also always want to see what new stuff is coming.
That's an exciting part of the job too.
Yeah. Yeah.
When Megan said I called her up to do an interview, and the reason I did that is because I got her book and read it and thought it was great. And when I discovered she lived locally, it made it a little easier. But I wanted to interview an artist who was doing that kind of work. And I saw Jim's work in '85 or so. It just blew me away.
Read it in the 15 minutes.
That's great.
This is for Megan and Jim together. You've both been with the company for a long time. Why do you keep working with Fantagraphics?
Yeah, I've always wanted to know that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go first.
Thank you.
I started out self-publishing, and I started at the time that Gary mentioned, where all the distributors were going out of business left and right, and that was my first experience. There were a lot of distributors when I started, and then they all went bankrupt and took my money. Amazingly, I managed to stick with the self-publishing for about 6 years, but by then I was just done. I was just like, no thank you. And
That was the late '90s?
yeah. Well, I mean, the end of my self-publishing.
Yeah.
So I was very happy to get a publisher. And the other part is that I don't put out books very often. And in the meantime of putting out books, I sometimes make mini comics. So or zines, as the younger people call them, which is like a less painful way of self-publishing than actually like trying to go through distributors and stuff. So I don't know, it's turned out to be just like a nice balance of kind of holding on to some independence of, you know, putting out the comics myself as I'm kind of figuring out what the next book will be, and then when I've got something, I know I have a home, and I think Fantagraphics has always had a tremendous amount of integrity and continues to, and I remain impressed with the cartoonists that they continue to publish, and they're nearby, so I can, you know, have a fair degree of like connection with the people who are making my book, so it all works out.
Jim?
Well, Fantagraphics started publishing Jim in 1985, and for years it was the lowest selling article in their roster, and I felt bad about that, but they seemed kind of cheerful that they were publishing this thing that wasn't making any money but had lots of artistic integrity, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to stay with these guys the rest of my life. I owe them that much. And it's been a good association. I feel proud to be published by Fantagraphics. I would consider Gary and Eric to be my friends as well as my publishers, and it's would be difficult for me to go anywhere else. I just feel at home there. And they will publish practically any piece of junk I hand in, so I can't say fairer than that, you know?
I remember Jim, you once said, I don't remember where or when or what, or if you, and I don't even know if you were talking about cartoonists or the staff or what, but you said Fantagraphics should just hang a sign outside the door that says, "Where else are you gonna go?"
I said that? Really? I think you have me confused with some synod.
With that thought in mind, this is a question for Max. He and I have talked about this before. Max, how surprised are you the company's still here after 50 years?
Shouldn't that be a question for me?
You too, but I just want to know what Max thinks.
I mean, you know, I have like, I ship a lot of like books, and some are popular and some aren't as popular as others, and you just, it seems like it's just sort of it's a collective, and you're just like sort of chopping wood and working towards this goal, and you know, some things miss, some things hit, and it's all just, I think it's miraculous that it's that it's like as healthy as it seems to be, and that it's a business that reinvests success into finding experimental, newer, like dangerous material and publishing that on the same platform as something as safe as like a Karl Barks or something. It's amazing. It's fantastic. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. All right, we're near the end. So any questions out there? No pressure.
You just covered him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was just wondering, I was talking to Tucker Stone and Larry Reed, and one of the few things that came up was how can younger readers like myself be more engaged in the independent comic industry instead of like per se buying it, like instead of just buying it, how can we be more engaged?
Do you live here in Seattle?
I live in Buck.
Okay. Max, you should answer that.
Yeah,
'cause you're like
the question is, how can younger readers be more engaged with independent material besides just buying it, right? Max,
Just buying it isn't bad.
Yeah, just buying
Yeah.
it.
Have a lot of it.
Yeah, that's the start. Max, you want to take that one since Eric volunteered you?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, being here and asking that question and being a part of the Seattle Comics community is the biggest part.
I have an idea.
Yes.
It's kind of an old-fashioned idea, but when I first started self-publishing comics, a lot of people had comics review zines that, you know, they self-published and they read a lot of comics, but then they wrote about them and talked about the ones they liked or didn't like, and they were really useful to cartoonists and readers, and I'm sure there's places to review comics online that are kind of like zines, or, you know, you could try making a paper zine, and then going to comic shows, you know, wherever you live, and sharing those kinds of things that you make with other people whose work you like.
Yeah, I was gonna add, I asked if you live locally, because there's Short Run, a comics festival, it happens in November.
If
And
you,
there's zine, you know, there's
Great
zine
people.
fests all over the country. I would say there's more zine fests now than there's ever been, and you know, that's a combination of like comics and prose publications. But
There's Dune once a month at Hugo House, which is a place where cartoonists gather to just talk comics, make comics, and come out with a zine every time they meet.
if you really want to make a connection with a favorite artist, write them a letter. Not post on Facebook, but write them a letter. They would love to get that. I mean, you know, they see stuff on Facebook all the time, but a personal letter, an email, sure. But you can, if it's a Fantagraphics product, you can write it care of Fantagraphics. They might write back. They might give you some art. You never know.
You know, that's the same question I asked myself 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So be careful.
Yeah, that's true. It's
In
yeah.
a way, I mean, it's a great question, and it's sort of what I was groping for, you know, 50 years ago. I mean, I was like, how do I survive? Because I didn't see any options.
How do you find community?
Yeah, how do you find people that you have kinship with, and how do you do something that you can believe in? I mean, that just seems to get harder and harder in this world. I mean, that you believe in, that's worth believing in. And yeah, those are all the questions I asked myself 50 years ago. So let us know when you come up with an answer.
All right, maybe one more. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, here.
Yeah, please.
Hi. No, this is a dream panel. It's wonderful. Thank you. Congratulations. One thing that those of us who work in comic studies in academia, I think to this day really appreciate the work you were doing, Gary and Mike, with Comics Journal, because that material is still really valuable for a lot of our studies. And I was curious how the rising stature of comics culturally, as well as in academia, university courses. I've written about Megan, and I've taught Jim's work in my classes at UW. How that changing stature of comics affects both your sales, right, which I'm sure is a factor, and also just in a way how you, the artists in particular, maybe regard what they're doing now versus 30 years ago.
Do you artists feel any greater sense of legitimacy because of the rise of, you know, comics in academia and I mean, you know, when we started the Comic Journal in '76, the idea that you would publish a magazine that published serious criticism about comics was just ridiculous. I mean, no one even believed such a thing could exist or even should exist. So the landscape is, you know, and even when we published, you know, Jim in '85 or '86, comics were not taken seriously by the mainstream media. And the Comic Journal was actually, I mean, it sounds so weird to say this because with the internet, everything has become decentralized, but the journal was really kind of a central forum for conversation about comics as an art form.
Right.
That's where you went when you wanted to talk about, you know, the aesthetics of comics. You know, we virtually had a monopoly on it because, you know, A, nobody else wanted to do it, and B, it's, you know, just a, you know, a financial disaster.
It became like the central place to have a discussion that was going to move things forward. But in terms of artists and their own view of themselves, any number of artists that I spoke with who worked in comics in the 50s and the 60s, the EC guys, people like Gil Kane, a lot of times when they would be at a social situation, a gathering, a party, whatever, and somebody would ask them what they would do, they would not say they drew comic books, even if that was their full-time job. They would say, I'm an artist, or I do advertising. They would avoid the idea that they drew comics. And now it's something somebody can say with pride, and then people will gather around and say, really, you draw comics? Tell me more. So that's a huge shift in the attitude, I think, over that period of time.
All right, I think that'll do it. Thank you to everybody for showing up. Thanks to the panelists, and thanks to Emerald City Comic Con.
Thank you all.